Good morning, this is your stat sensei, Mr. Spensey, and this is an exit ticket on the T interval. And really, we're focusing on actually creating the T star. Okay, so this is from our note spiral, and it says a publishing company has just published a new college textbook. Before the company decides the price at which to sell the textbook, it wants to know the average price of such textbook in the market. The research department at the company took a random sample of 36 textbooks. Good that they told us it's a random sample. We know our sample size right here happens to be 36 out of more than 1,000. So when we do our comparison, n is less than 10%. So we're comparing to that 1,000. So that's important. The sample survey produced a mean of 70.50. So that's telling us our X bar is 70.50 and a sample standard deviation of 45.33. The fact that we're using the sample standard deviation lets me know I'm using a t statistic. And then it wants us to construct a 90% confidence interval for the price of this textbook. Also, they tell us the author of the textbook claims the textbook is worth $85 or more. Using the above scenario, calculate a 90% interval and comment on the author's claim. Well, the formula is X bar plus or minus T star S divided by square root of N, where that's the sample mean. That's the T star that's driven by this 90% and the size of our sample, which is 36. Standard deviation of the sample, and this is the square root of N. So here's what we need to do. We're going to go to, first off, we've written the formula down. Now we're going to go ahead and plug in what we know. Well, what I know is I know that my sample mean is 70.5. I know my sample standard deviation is 45.33, and I know my sample size is 36. But how do I get that T star? Well, I'm going to have to go second vars inverse T and put in 1 minus 0.90 divided by 2 for my area. And my degrees of freedom are going to be 36 minus 1. Oops. And you could have just typed in 35 if you prefer. At which point I get 1.6895. Go ahead and make that positive. And so that's where our T star comes from. Well, now that we have all that information, we can actually run and set up our confidence interval. So stat, test, drop down to number 8, T interval. Make sure stats is highlighted. In this case, our X bar was 70.50. Our S was 45.33. Our sample size was 36, and we want a confidence level of 90% or 0.90. And I get an interval of 57.735 and 83.265 is the upper bound. So when we actually were drawing our picture, all confidence intervals are centered on X bar. So this is centered on that 70.5. That's exactly in the middle. There's my lower bound that I calculated. There's my upper bound. So now we're supposed to comment on whether or not it's worth $85. And the answer is no, that's not a plausible response or a plausible answer because $85 does not lie within the interval. If it were 83.26, we go, yeah, that's plausible. So what we consider plausible values are anything between 57.735 and $83.26. All right? Moving on, letter B. Use the above scenario to calculate a 95% confidence interval. So essentially, we're doing the same thing. We have exactly the same formula. We have exactly the same sample mean. Matter of fact, that's all the same. That didn't change. And we're still centered on the same X bar. We're still centered on that 70.5, but we need to go calculate that T star. So second vars, inverse T. And this time, instead of 1 minus 0.90, we're going to use 95. Our degrees of freedom are still the same, and we end up getting 2.0301. Well, now that we have all that information, let's go ahead and do a t-interval. I just need to change my confidence level to 0.95. And I get 55.163 to 85.837. Now, he claimed that it was $85. Is this a reasonable claim? And the answer is, yeah, it's reasonable because $85, although it barely fits in there, it looks like it goes up to about $85.84. So $85 definitely is in the interval, but because 85 is in the interval, so the author's claim is plausible. So 95%, we can't say that the author is wrong. At 90%, we said we could. Now, if you notice, 57 to 55, the lower is lower. And if we look at this, the upper is upper. I mean, the upper is upper. The upper is higher. So the lower is lower and the upper bound is higher. So it looks like our interval is getting wider, and it is getting wider. And the reason it's getting wider is because we went from 90 to 95%. As your confidence level goes up, the interval gets wider. All right, part C. Using the above scenario, calculate a 99% confidence interval. Well, once again, we're still working with the same formula. And so at that point, we know the sample mean, the sample standard deviation, and the sample size are all going to be the same. We're still going to be centered on the 70.5, and we're looking for an area between these two bars of about 99%. Okay? Well, we still need to calculate that T star, so second vars, inverse T, 1 minus 0.99. Oops, that's not going to work. Let's just clear that out. Parenthesis, 1 minus 0.99, close parenthesis, divided by 2. Our degrees of freedom is 36 minus 1, or n minus 1, sample size minus 1. And we end up getting 2.7238. So that's our T star. And now we're ready to run the test. So stat test T interval. The sample mean is 70.5. The sample standard deviation is still 45.33. The sample size is 36, but our confidence level is now 0.99. We calculate and we find that our lower bound is even lower at $40.92, but our upper bound is even higher at $91. So there's our lower bound. That's our upper bound. That's the interval we expect it to lie within. And is it plausible? Well, yeah, it's plausible because $85 definitely lies within that interval. So what do you notice about the three different intervals? Well, as the confidence level increases, the interval of textbook prices gets wider or more spread out. So as the confidence level increases, the interval gets wider, right? As CL increases, the interval gets wider. So if you notice, every single time we increased our interval, we went from 90 to 95 to 99. The lower bound got lower. It got smaller. It went from 57 to 55 to 49. And the upper bound got higher. So that means it's getting more spread out or wider. All right. I hope this helps, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.